In the blistering summer of 1962, the entire Sterling family vanished without a trace from their isolated ranch in Prosperity Creek, Texas. 45 years later, a routine renovation of their long-abandoned home would reveal a secret hidden beneath the floorboards, exposing a truth far more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. The dust of decades had settled over a lie, but it had not erased the crime buried at the heart of the town's founding myth. Prosperity Creek was a place held together by tradition and the unspoken rules of a tight-knit community. It was a town where a man's word was his bond, and appearances were everything. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, a stretch of sun-scorched earth where secrets could easily be swallowed by the horizon. The people who lived there prided themselves on resilience and a shared history, one that was about to be challenged in the most profound way. The Sterlings were a cornerstone of this community, seen by all as respectable and hard-working. John Sterling, a quiet man with the thoughtful eyes of a scientist, was a geologist by training, but a rancher by necessity. He spent his days surveying the arid land, his mind always seeming to be somewhere deeper, sifting through layers of rock and time. His neighbors knew him as reserved, but brilliant, a man more comfortable with maps than with idle chatter. His wife, Mary, was his perfect counterpart. She was the family's social anchor, a pillar of the local church whose warmth and kindness were legendary in Prosperity Creek. Mary organized bake sales, taught Sunday school, and her garden was the envy of the county. She was the vibrant heart of the Sterling household, a woman who seemed to embody the very decency the town claimed to represent. Her sudden absence would leave a void that felt unnatural and deeply unsettling. Their two children, 10-year-old David and 7-year-old Emily, were fixtures of town life. They were bright, energetic kids, often seen chasing each other through the town square during picnics or helping their mother at church events. David was his father's shadow, fascinated by the rocks John brought home, while Emily was her mother's echo, humming hymns as she played with her dolls. Their laughter was a familiar sound that would soon be replaced by an unnerving silence. The night they disappeared, a ferocious thunderstorm descended upon the region. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rattled the windows of every home in Prosperity Creek. The torrential rain turned dusty roads into impassable rivers of mud, effectively cutting the isolated Sterling ranch off from the rest of the world. It was the kind of storm that erased footprints and muffled sounds, a perfect cover for any activity, innocent or otherwise, that might have taken place under the cloak of darkness. When the family failed to appear at church that Sunday, concern began to ripple through the congregation. The sheriff, a man more accustomed to settling property disputes than investigating serious crimes, was called to the ranch. He found the front door unlocked, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the house was eerily still, a scene frozen in the middle of an ordinary evening. The silence itself felt like a scream that no one could hear. On the dining room table sat 4 plates of half-eaten stew, the food cold and congealed. A glass of milk had been spilled, its path a pale stain on the dark wood. In the living room, a book lay open on a chair, its pages still holding the place of a reader who would never return. The scene didn't suggest a struggle, it suggested an interruption, as if the family had been plucked from their lives mid-sentence. The initial search was brief and perfunctory. The sheriff and a few volunteers combed the immediate property, their boots sinking into the mud left by the storm. They found no tracks, no broken fences, no signs of a disturbance. The vastness of the Texas landscape seemed to mock their efforts, a silent accomplice that had already swallowed any evidence that might have existed. After just a few days, the official search was called off. It was John Sterling's business partner, Silas Blackwood, who provided the town with a narrative it could accept. Silas was everything John was not, charismatic, outgoing, and deeply embedded in the town's social and financial hierarchy. He addressed the worried townsfolk with a heavy heart, explaining that John had secretly been sinking into a deep well of debt. The ranch, he claimed, was on the verge of foreclosure, a fact John had hidden out of shame. The story Silas wove was one of desperation and escape. He painted a picture of John Sterling as a proud man who couldn't bear the thought of public failure. Fleeing in the dead of night, Silas suggested, was his only way out. He had likely taken his family to start a new life somewhere else, far from the judgment of their neighbors. It was a tidy explanation that absolved the community of any responsibility and offered a simple, albeit tragic, answer. With no bodies and a plausible, if heartbreaking, motive, the sheriff's department unofficially closed the case. The Sterlings were not missing. They were fugitives from their own life. The town, eager to move on from the unsettling mystery, quickly adopted this version of events. It was easier to believe in a man's financial ruin than to confront the possibility that something violent had happened in their peaceful corner of the world. Over the next year, Silas Blackwood methodically settled the Sterling estate. Citing a significant outstanding debt owed to him by John, he acquired the sprawling ranch and all its assets for a fraction of their true market value. He presented the transaction as a reluctant necessity, a sad duty to his vanished friend. To the people of Prosperity Creek, it looked like Silas was simply cleaning up a mess left behind by a coward. The Sterling home was left to decay, a silent monument to the family that had vanished. Its windows grew cloudy with dust, and weeds choked Mary's once beautiful garden. It became a place children dared each other to approach on Halloween, a ghost house at the edge of town. The story of the family who ran from their debts became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation to the next. As years turned into decades, the official narrative became cemented as historical fact. The memory of the real Sterlings, the quiet geologist, the kind churchgoer, the laughing children, faded, replaced by the simplified caricatures of the town's ghost story. The wound of their disappearance had scarred over, hidden beneath layers of time, assumption, and the collective will to forget. Who would benefit from questioning a story that everyone had already accepted? The name Sterling was now synonymous with failure and abandonment. The ranch, now the cornerstone of the Blackwood family's growing empire, flourished under Silas's hand. He became one of the town's most respected and powerful figures, a patriarch whose success was seen as a testament to his sharp business acumen and unwavering character. His version of the past was the only one that mattered. But truth has a way of lingering, like a faint echo in a dusty room. It resides not in stories, but in physical spaces, in the wood, the stone, and the soil. The Sterling house, though abandoned, held the real story within its walls. It was a silent witness, patiently guarding a secret that had been sealed away on a stormy night so many years ago. The town of Prosperity Creek had built its future on the foundation of Silas Blackwood's success, a success that began the very year the Sterlings disappeared. The community had chosen comfort over curiosity, accepting a simple lie rather than facing a complicated truth. They had all, in their own way, become complicit in the silence that followed the storm. For 45 years that silence held. The disappearance of the Sterling family was a closed chapter, a piece of local folklore. No one had any reason to look back, to question the official story, or to disturb the ghosts of the past. The case was not just cold, it was frozen in the amber of a town's collective memory, seemingly forever. What no one knew was that the key to unlocking the entire mystery was not lost to the sprawling Texas landscape. It was not in a faraway city where a family had supposedly started a new life. It was right there in the home they had been forced to leave behind, waiting for the simple, violent act of a crowbar to pry it loose from its hiding place. The story the town told itself was one of shame and escape. It was a narrative that allowed life to go on, for new foundations to be laid over old ground. But it was a story built on a deliberate and monstrous deception, a lie designed to protect a man who had wrapped himself in the cloak of respectability. The official record stated that the Sterlings had run. The town's memory insisted they were cowards. Even their own home, left to rot, seemed to accuse them of abandonment. Every piece of the accepted history pointed to a family that had simply walked away from their responsibilities, leaving a trail of debt and unanswered questions in their wake. But what if the house told a different story? What if the evidence of their final moments wasn't scattered by the wind, but had been carefully preserved, sealed away from the world? The final truth of their fate was not a matter of speculation, but a physical reality, locked in a place no one had ever thought to look. The world had moved on, convinced it knew what had happened on that stormy night in 1962. The disappearance was a settled matter, a sad footnote in the history of Prosperity Creek. But the truth was far more complex and terrifying than anyone had ever imagined, and it had been lying dormant just a few inches beneath their feet all along. The year is 2007. 45 years of relentless Texas sun have bleached the Sterling Ranch house to the color of bone. The paint is a distant memory, peeling in sun-scorched strips from the weathered wood. A young couple from Austin, enamored with the idea of restoring a piece of history, purchased the property for a pittance, unaware they were buying not just land, but a tomb for a story everyone thought they knew. They hired a local construction crew whose first task was to gut the interior and replace the rotted, warped floorboards that groaned under every footstep. The work was grueling, a battle against dust, decay, and the oppressive summer heat that seemed to have soaked into the very foundation of the home. For weeks, the sounds of hammers and saws echoed across the property, a stark contrast to the decades of silence that had preceded them. The crew saw the house as a simple job, a structure to be stripped down and rebuilt. They knew the local legend of the family who ran, but to them it was just a ghost story, a bit of color to an otherwise mundane project. It was a Tuesday afternoon when a young worker named Carlos was tasked with prying up the last of the original flooring in the master bedroom. The wood was stubborn, fused together by time and humidity. With a grunt of effort, he jammed his crowbar into a seam, leveraging his weight against the tool. The old pine plank resisted, then surrendered with a loud crack that split the board clean down the middle, the sound sharp and violent in the dusty air. The fracture revealed something that wasn't supposed to be there, a dark void beneath the subfloor. Leaning closer, Carlos swept away a thick blanket of dust and splinters. Embedded in the darker wood of the subfloor was a tarnished, recessed iron ring, the kind used for a cellar door or a hidden hatch. It was flush with the surface, clearly designed to be concealed. There were no records of a cellar in this part of the house, no architectural plans that mentioned a room beneath the master bedroom. He called his foreman over, his voice laced with a curiosity that momentarily cut through the day's exhaustion. Together, the two men heaved on the ring. The hatch was heavy, its edges sealed by 45 years of settled dust and grime. With a final coordinated pull, it gave way, opening with a deep groan that seemed to emanate from the past itself. A wave of cool, stale air washed over them, carrying a scent that was both musty and strangely preserved, like air from a sealed jar. It was the smell of a place untouched by time, a pocket of 1962 that had survived, hidden and undisturbed, into the new millennium. They peered into the darkness, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the gloom. It was a small, cramped chamber, no larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were lined with thick, sound-dampening material now yellowed with age. This wasn't a root cellar, it was a bunker, a deliberate sanctuary designed for concealment. A small cot was pushed against one wall, a thin mattress and a folded blanket still resting upon it. A few cans of preserved peaches and beans were neatly stacked in a corner, their labels faded but still legible. On the floor, in the center of the cramped space, sat a small wooden chest. It was a child's toy chest, carved with simple images of cowboys and horses. Unlike the rest of the house, it was remarkably well preserved, protected from the elements by its subterranean tomb. The discovery had now shifted from a structural anomaly to something deeply personal. The foreman, a man who had heard the Sterling story his whole life, felt a chill crawl up his spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the cool air rising from the chamber. The local sheriff was called, a pragmatic man named Henderson, who was initially more annoyed than intrigued by the interruption. He arrived expecting to find old moonshine bottles or perhaps an animal den. But upon seeing the hidden room and its contents, his demeanor changed entirely. He understood immediately that this was not a forgotten cellar. This was a deliberate hiding place, and the presence of the toy chest suggested it was meant for the Sterling children. The official narrative of a family fleeing their debts began to feel thin and hollow. With careful gloved hands, Sheriff Henderson lifted the lid of the wooden chest. On top lay a well-loved rag doll with yarn for hair. Next to it a small collection of colorful rocks, the kind a budding young geologist might collect. These were Emily's doll and David's stones, objects that spoke not of a planned escape, but of a desperate attempt to bring comfort into a place of fear. Beneath these toys, Henderson's fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of a leather-bound book. It was a journal. The leather was worn, and the embossed initials on the cover were faint but clear, M.S. Mary Sterling. The discovery sent a jolt through the small group gathered around the opening. This was not just an artifact. It was a voice from the grave, a potential witness to a mystery that had long been relegated to folklore. The sheriff carefully placed the journal into an evidence bag, his mind racing with the implications. The story of the family who ran away had just been confronted with its first piece of contradictory evidence. News of the discovery spread through Prosperity Creek like a wildfire on a dry prairie. For the first time in nearly half a century, the Sterling case was no longer a closed book. The journal was sent to the state capitol, where it landed on the desk of a specialist in the Texas Rangers Unsolved Crimes Investigation Program. Her name was Isabella Rossi, a detective whose reputation was built on her refusal to let the past stay buried. She saw cold cases not as historical footnotes, but as unhealed wounds demanding justice. Ranger Rossi was sharp and methodical, a woman who trusted facts over folklore. She read the initial report from Prosperity Creek with a growing sense of conviction. A hidden room, children's toys, a secret diary. These were not the hallmarks of a family skipping town to avoid creditors. They were the signs of a family preparing for a threat, a family that knew danger was coming for them. The official story, she concluded within minutes, was a lie. The question was, who had benefited from that lie for 45 long years? Simultaneously, word reached a quiet elderly man living in San Antonio. Arthur Vance, now in his 70s, was Mary Sterling's nephew. He was just a young man when his aunt's family vanished, and he had spent his entire adult life haunted by their disappearance. He had never believed the official story, never accepted that the kind, devout family he knew would simply abandon their lives. For decades he had carried the weight of their tarnished legacy, a lonely defender of their honor against a town that had branded them cowards. When Arthur received the call about the discovery at the old ranch, a lifetime of quiet grief and stubborn hope coalesced into a single, sharp point of focus. He drove to Prosperity Creek immediately, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and vindication. He needed to see the room, to touch the journal, to be a part of the investigation that would finally uncover the truth he had always felt in his bones. He was the last living relative, the keeper of a memory that the rest of the world had tried to erase. Ranger Rossi and Arthur Vance met for the first time in the sterile environment of an evidence room, the leather-bound journal resting on a steel table between them. Rossi saw in Arthur's eyes the deep personal cost of an unsolved crime. Arthur saw in Rossi a formidable professional ally, the first person in a position of power to ever take his family's case seriously. An unspoken pact was formed between them. She would provide the resources of the law, and he would provide the context of a life stolen. Rossi had already read through most of the journal. Mary's entries painted a portrait of a loving family and a life deeply rooted in the community. She wrote of church picnics, of her children's small triumphs at school, and of her husband John's quiet obsession with the geology of their land. There was no mention of financial ruin, no hint of desperation. Instead, the pages were filled with a sense of contentment and hope for the future, making the final entry all the more jarring. With Arthur watching, his hands trembling slightly, Rossi turned to the last page. The handwriting was different here, rushed, tight, the letters pressed hard into the paper. The ink was slightly smeared, as if written in haste or with unsteady hands. The date at the top of the page was August 14th, 1962, the day of the storm, the night the Sterling family vanished from the face of the earth. The words that followed would irrevocably shatter 45 years of carefully constructed fiction. The entry was chillingly brief, a final frantic testament from a woman bracing for a cataclysm. Rossi read the words aloud, her voice steady, but unable to mask the gravity of their meaning. Silas is coming to discuss the find in the south pasture. John says it will change everything. He told me to get the children ready, just in case. The mention of Silas Blackwood, John's business partner and the architect of the original narrative, hung in the air like a death sentence. The final sentence of the entry was the most damning. He made this room for storms, but the real storm is a man. In that single line, Mary Sterling had unmasked her killer. The storm that had supposedly covered the family's escape was not one of rain and thunder, but one of human greed and violence. The hidden room was not a shelter from lightning. It was a futile defense against a predator who was about to arrive at their door. For Arthur Vance, hearing those words was both a moment of profound validation and deep sorrow. The truth was finally emerging, but it confirmed his worst fears. His family had not run away. They had been silenced. They had been victims, not fugitives. The shame he had carried for them his entire life was not theirs to bear, but belonged to the man who had orchestrated their disappearance and then poisoned their memory to cover his tracks. Ranger Rossi closed the journal, her expression set like stone. The words transformed the entire investigation. This was no longer a missing persons case. The discovery of the room and the diary's final terrified entry provided more than enough cause to reclassify the disappearance of the Sterling family. The official designation was changed from a cold case to an active quadruple homicide investigation. The primary and only suspect was Silas Blackwood. The lie that had held Prosperity Creek together for nearly 5 decades had been broken open. The narrative of a family escaping debt was now exposed as a carefully crafted deception designed to conceal a monstrous crime. The journal was the key, the first piece of physical evidence that contradicted the official story. It pointed the way toward a new truth, one that was buried deep beneath the town's foundations, both literally and figuratively. The discovery of the hidden room was the spark, but Mary Sterling's diary was the accelerant. It ignited a firestorm that would force the town of Prosperity Creek to confront the dark secret at the heart of its own prosperity. The investigation was no longer about finding a family that had left. It was now about finding the bodies of a family that had been taken. The ghost story had become a murder mystery. The first question was answered. The Sterlings did not flee. But this answer only gave rise to more urgent and dangerous questions. Why did Silas Blackwood come to the ranch that night? What was the find in the south pasture that was supposed to change everything? And most importantly, Where had he hidden the bodies of John, Mary, David, and Emily for the past 45 years? The path to justice was now clear, but it would lead through the heart of the town's most powerful family. The case file, once a thin folder gathering dust in a county archive, was now the center of a major Texas Rangers investigation. It was filled with new photographs of the hidden room, forensic reports on the journal, and a detailed analysis of Mary's final words. The weight of the past was pressing down on the present, demanding a reckoning that was long overdue. The silence that had protected a killer for so long was about to be shattered. Isabella Rossi knew this would be the most difficult case of her career. She wasn't just investigating a man, she was challenging a town's founding myth. Silas Blackwood was not some forgotten recluse. He was a beloved patriarch, a pillar of the community whose wealth and influence were woven into the very fabric of Prosperity Creek. To take him down, she would need more than a diary entry. She would need irrefutable proof. Arthur Vance, for his part, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a keeper of memory. He was an active participant in the search for justice. He would work alongside Rossi, providing insights into his family and the town he once knew, determined to see the truth fully revealed and his family's names officially and publicly cleared. His long, lonely vigil was finally over. The fight had just begun. The implications of the diary entry were staggering. It suggested a crime of immense premeditation and brutality, followed by a cover-up that had been successfully maintained for nearly half a century through influence and intimidation. The entire history of the town and the fortune of its most prominent family was built upon the graves of the Sterlings. The investigation would not just solve a murder, it would rewrite history. The reclassification of the case sent shockwaves through the community, forcing old-timers to re-examine memories they had long since filed away. The story they had accepted for so long was now being challenged by the state's most elite law enforcement agency. Loyalties would be tested, and the carefully maintained peace of Prosperity Creek was about to be broken by the ghosts of 1962, finally given a voice. The discovery under the floorboards had changed everything. It was the inciting incident, the single accidental discovery that unraveled a decades-old conspiracy. The crowbar that split the warped plank had also split open a secret, revealing a truth far more sinister than the simple tale of a family's financial ruin. The real story was one of murder, betrayal, and immense greed. The diary provided the first crucial breadcrumb, pointing the investigation toward a motive hidden in the south pasture. It was a starting point, a thread that Rossi could begin to pull. She knew that unraveling it would reveal a tapestry of deceit that had been woven with patience and ruthlessness. The path forward was now illuminated by the faint light of a 45-year-old clue. But this discovery was just the first piece of a macabre puzzle that no one was prepared to assemble. Ranger Isabella Rossi established a temporary command post in a rented office above the Prosperity Creek Courthouse, a space that smelled of old paper and stale justice. From her window she could see the town square, dominated by a bronze statue of its most generous benefactor, a younger, formidable Silas Blackwood. It was a stark, daily reminder that she was not merely investigating a man, but challenging the very foundation of the town's identity. Her team, a small, hand-picked group of forensic analysts and seasoned investigators, began the painstaking work of digitizing every shred of the original 1962 case file. They were looking for inconsistencies, for details the original sheriff had overlooked, or more likely, had been encouraged to ignore. The past was about to be put under a modern microscope, and its secrets would not withstand the scrutiny. Arthur Vance became an invaluable, if unofficial, member of the investigative team. His mind was a living archive of the Sterling family, a repository of anecdotes and details that no official document could ever capture. He spent hours with Rossi, recounting childhood visits to the ranch, describing the specific chime of Mary's grandfather clock, and the way John would meticulously label every rock specimen on his desk. These were not just sentimental memories. They were crucial data points that helped Rossi build a psychological profile of the victims. Arthur's presence humanized the case, transforming the faded black and white photographs of the Sterlings into vibrant living people whose stolen future demanded a reckoning. He was the ghost in the machine, a constant, quiet reminder of what had been lost. The first order of business was the forensic examination of Mary Sterling's journal. The leather-bound book was sent to a state-of-the-art lab in Austin, where specialists analyzed the paper composition, the chemical signature of the ink, and the pressure of the handwriting. The analysis confirmed that all entries, including the final frantic one, were written with the same pen and by the same hand. More importantly, graphology experts determined the final entry showed signs of extreme duress. The indentations were deep, the letters tight and angular, consistent with someone writing in a state of fear and urgency. This scientific validation dismantled any potential defense that the entry was a forgery or a flight of fancy. It was Mary's authentic voice, a terrified whisper that had finally found its audience after 45 years. With the diary's authenticity established, Rossi's focus narrowed to its most cryptic and promising clue, the find in the south pasture. The phrase was a beacon in the fog of the past, a tangible starting point in a case with no bodies and no crime scene. Rossi pulled the original property deeds and survey maps from 1962, spreading them across a large table. John Sterling, she reminded her team, was not just a rancher, he was a trained geologist. He would have been surveying his land not for cattle grazing patterns, but for what lay beneath. What could a man like that find in a barren Texas pasture that would, as Mary wrote, change everything? The question hung in the air of the command post, pregnant with the promise of a motive far grander than simple debt. The initial approach to the Blackwood family was met with a wall of polished legal obstruction. Silas Blackwood, now 87 and confined to a wheelchair, remained secluded in his sprawling mansion on the edge of town, a fortress built on the profits from the land he had acquired from the Sterlings. All communication was routed through his team of high-priced lawyers who portrayed Rossi's investigation as a cruel and unnecessary disruption to the life of a revered community elder. They presented Silas as a grieving friend who had been forced to clean up John Sterling's financial mess, a narrative he had successfully sold to the town for nearly half a century. Their strategy was clear: delay, deflect, and discredit the investigation at every turn. Rossi arranged a formal interview with Silas Blackwood at his home, a concession she made to avoid further legal delays. The mansion was a museum of wealth and power, its walls adorned with portraits of Silas shaking hands with governors and senators. Silas himself was physically frail, but his eyes were as sharp and calculating as ever. He spoke in a soft, grandfatherly tone, recounting the story of John's shameful flight with a practiced air of sorrow. He claimed to have loved the Sterling family and was heartbroken by John's betrayal. It was a masterful performance, a symphony of feigned grief and benevolent concern that had worked flawlessly for 45 years. He was the picture of a man wronged by his friend, not a predator who had stolen his life. When Rossi produced a copy of Mary's final diary entry, the atmosphere in the room shifted. She read the words aloud. "Silas is coming to discuss the find in the south pasture." A flicker of something cold and ancient passed through Blackwood's eyes before being replaced by a look of weary pity. He dismissed the entry as the product of a troubled mind. Mary, he suggested gently, was prone to anxiety. The find, he explained with a dismissive wave of his hand, was likely just a misunderstanding about a new well John wanted to drill. He claimed he went to the ranch earlier that day to talk John out of another foolish, expensive venture, then went home before the storm hit. His explanation was smooth, plausible, and utterly devoid of verifiable detail. Rossi pressed him on his alibi for the night of the storm. In his 1962 statement to the original sheriff, Silas had claimed he was at home with his wife, who had been ill, and that they had gone to bed early, sleeping through the worst of the thunder and rain. His wife had since passed away, making her unable to corroborate his story. When Rossi asked if anyone else, a maid, a groundskeeper, could confirm his presence at the mansion that night, Silas's folksy demeanor hardened. He curtly stated that it was a private family matter, and that the staff had been given the night off due to the impending storm. The alibi was convenient, airtight, and entirely dependent on the word of a dead woman and the absence of any other witnesses. The cracks in Silas Blackwood's story, though subtle, were beginning to show. Back at the command post, Rossi's team cross-referenced his 1962 statement with other documents from the time. They found a logbook from the town's only telephone operator, a woman who had meticulously recorded all long-distance calls. The log showed a call placed from the Blackwood residence at 11:47 p.m. on the night of the storm, long after Silas claimed to be asleep. The call was made to a law firm in Dallas, known for its aggressive work in mineral rights litigation. Why would a man, supposedly sleeping through a storm while his friend was skipping town, be making a late-night call to an oil and gas lawyer? This discovery prompted a new line of inquiry, finding surviving witnesses who had been overlooked in the original perfunctory investigation. Rossi tasked 2 junior rangers with tracking down anyone who had lived near the Sterling Ranch in 1962. They spent weeks poring over old census records, church directories, and high school yearbooks. Most of the names on their list were now inscriptions on tombstones, but a few were still alive, their memories of that stormy night clouded by the intervening decades. Rossi knew, however, that time could sometimes clarify rather than obscure, stripping away the non-essential details and leaving behind the stark, indelible moments that mattered. Their first breakthrough came from an elderly man named Hector Morales, who was living in a nursing home in San Antonio. In 1962, he was a teenager working as a farmhand on a neighboring property. He told the rangers that he had been securing livestock in a barn when the storm rolled in. He remembered seeing the distinctive headlights of Silas Blackwood's Cadillac not leaving the area, but turning down the long, muddy lane that led directly to the Sterling Ranch. He recalled it clearly because he thought it was strange for a man like Mr. Blackwood to be out in such a terrible storm. This testimony directly contradicted Silas's claim that he had been home all evening. The second key witness was the retired telephone operator, a sharp-witted woman in her 90s named Clara Bellwether. She vividly remembered the call from the Blackwood residence that night. She told Rossi that it wasn't just the late hour that was unusual, but the tone of Silas's voice. He had sounded agitated and breathless, not like a man who had just been woken up, but like a man who had been running. He had insisted the call was an emergency and needed to be connected immediately. Clara's memory provided crucial context to the logbook entry, painting a picture of a man in the midst of a crisis, not one sleeping peacefully through a storm. Arthur Vance provided another crucial piece of the puzzle, a memory that contradicted the very premise of the official narrative. He recalled a phone conversation with his Aunt Mary just 2 days before she disappeared. She had been ecstatic, telling him that John had made a geological discovery on their land that was going to secure their family's future forever. She had spoken of plans to pay off the mortgage and set up college funds for the children. This directly refuted Silas's story of a family sinking into debt. The Sterlings weren't facing financial ruin. They were on the cusp of immense wealth. Rossi laid out the new evidence on a large whiteboard in the command center. Hector Morales's eyewitness account placed Silas's car at the Sterling Ranch during the storm. Clara Bellwether's testimony confirmed he was awake and making urgent clandestine phone calls late that night. Arthur Vance's memory provided a powerful counter-narrative to the official story of financial desperation. For the first time, a coherent timeline of events began to emerge, one in which Silas Blackwood was not a passive observer, but an active participant in the events of that night. The 45-year-old alibi was not just cracked, it was crumbling. Armed with this new information, Rossi shifted her focus back to the find in the South Pasture. The phrase now seemed less like a mystery and more like a treasure map. She knew that simply digging up a 45-year-old pasture would be a futile, needle-in-a-haystack endeavor. She needed a more sophisticated approach. She made a call to the State University's geology department, the same one where John Sterling had earned his degree decades earlier. She requested a full geological survey of the former Sterling property, utilizing the most advanced subsurface imaging technology available. She was going to see what John Sterling had seen. The Blackwood family's legal team immediately filed an injunction to block the survey, claiming it was an unwarranted invasion of their private property and a baseless fishing expedition. The legal battle was fierce and public, drawing statewide media attention to the small town of Prosperity Creek. The court fight was a calculated risk for the Blackwoods. While it delayed the investigation, their aggressive opposition also made them look guilty. Why fight so hard to prevent a simple geological survey if there was nothing to hide? Rossi's team used the delay to build their case further, arguing in court that the survey was the only way to verify or disprove the central claim in the victim's diary. After a week of heated legal arguments, the judge ruled in Rossi's favor. The court order granted her team full access to the South Pasture. The arrival of the Geological Survey team was a major event in Prosperity Creek. Trucks equipped with ground-penetrating radar and seismic vibrators rumbled through the town, a 21st-century intrusion into a 20th-century mystery. The team began their work methodically, sending sound waves deep into the earth and recording the echoes that bounced back. They were creating a detailed three-dimensional map of the subterranean world that John Sterling had once studied with far simpler tools. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the ground would give up. For 2 days, the data that came back was unremarkable, showing typical sedimentary rock formations common to the region. The Blackwood lawyers looked smug, and a sense of anticlimax settled over the investigation. But on the third day, the lead geophysicist called Rossi over to a monitor displaying a complex series of colored layers. He pointed to a massive deep anomaly, a geological formation that was completely absent from any existing state surveys of the area. It was a vast porous shale deposit trapped between two impermeable layers of rock, a perfect geological structure for containing a massive reservoir of oil and natural gas. The discovery was staggering. The geophysicist estimated the reservoir, which lay almost entirely beneath the original Sterling Ranch, held billions of barrels of oil. It was a find that would rival some of the largest in Texas history. John Sterling, with his expertise and his intimate knowledge of his own land, would have undoubtedly identified this formation. He wasn't on the verge of bankruptcy. He was on the verge of becoming one of the most powerful oil barons in the state. The find in the South Pasture was not a water well. It was a treasure chest of black gold buried thousands of feet beneath the dusty soil. Suddenly, the entire motive for the crime snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. This wasn't about a small ranching debt. This was about a fortune of unimaginable scale. John Sterling had discovered the oil, and his business partner, Silas Blackwood, had wanted it for himself. The story of John's financial ruin was not just a cover-up. It was a brilliant piece of misdirection, a lie designed to obscure an act of monumental greed. Silas hadn't just killed his partner and his family. He had stolen their legacy, their future, and the very ground beneath their feet, building his own empire, directly on top of their graves. With the geological report in hand, Rossi confronted Silas Blackwood a second time. This time, there was no pretense of a friendly chat. She laid the seismic maps on his polished mahogany desk, the vibrant colors of the oil reservoir, a stark accusation against the room's muted tones. For the first time, Silas's composure shattered. A flicker of pure, undiluted rage crossed his face before he masked it with a sneer. He called the report a fantasy, a desperate attempt by an ambitious ranger to make a name for herself by destroying a good man's reputation. But the denial was brittle, the performance no longer convincing. He knew she had found the why. The geological discovery changed the public perception of the case overnight. The story of the Sterling family's secret fortune spread like wildfire, recasting them as tragic victims of a ruthless conspiracy. The town, which had once whispered about John Sterling as a coward, now began to whisper about Silas Blackwood as a monster. Lifelong loyalties began to fray as people re-examined their memories, seeing past events through the new, damning lens of the oil discovery. The wall of silence that had protected Silas for so long was beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. Rossi's team now launched a full-scale forensic accounting investigation into Silas Blackwood's finances, starting in 1962. They unearthed a complex web of shell corporations and land trusts that Silas had established in the months before the Sterlings vanished. He had been preparing to seize the mineral rights all along. After their disappearance, he had used a series of falsified loan documents, the supposed proof of John's debt, to legally foreclose on the Sterling ranch and transfer all its assets, including the now priceless mineral rights, to one of his own companies. The paper trail was a meticulous roadmap of his crime. The evidence was now overwhelming. Silas had the motive, billions in oil, the opportunity, his alibi was broken, and he had orchestrated a sophisticated financial cover-up. Yet Rossi knew it was still circumstantial. A clever defense attorney could argue that Silas had simply outmaneuvered his partner in a business deal, and that the Sterlings had still chosen to run away. Without the bodies or a direct confession, a conviction would be difficult. She needed something more, something that irrefutably tied Silas not just to the financial fraud, but to the act of murder itself. What final piece of evidence was still missing? The investigation circled back to its point of origin, the small hidden room beneath the master bedroom. Rossi became convinced that the room held more secrets than it had already revealed. She ordered a second, more intensive forensic search of the tiny chamber, believing that a family preparing for a threat might have hidden something more than just themselves. She reasoned that if Mary hid her diary in the children's toy chest, perhaps John, the methodical geologist, had hidden something of his own. The team was instructed to examine every square inch of the space, from the soundproofing on the walls to the floorboards beneath the cot. The forensic team, dressed in sterile white suits, descended into the cramped space. They used ultraviolet lights to search for biological evidence and electronic sensors to detect any hidden voids. For hours they found nothing but dust and decay. Then one of the technicians, running a density scanner over the floor, noticed a small, inconsistent reading directly under the spot where the cot had been placed. It was a section of the subfloor that was slightly less dense than the wood around it, as if it had been hollowed out. It was a hiding place within a hiding place, a secret concealed by a secret. With painstaking care, the technician used a small pry bar to lift the section of flooring. Beneath it was a small, crudely carved-out cavity. Nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a small, flat tin box, the kind used for storing tobacco or fishing lures. It was heavier than it looked, and as the technician lifted it out, the palpable sense of anticipation in the small room was suffocating. This was not a random object. It had been deliberately hidden in the family's final moments, a last desperate act of preservation against the coming storm. The tin box was carefully placed in an evidence container and rushed back to the command post. Arthur Vance was present when Rossi, wearing gloves, prepared to open it. He looked at the simple metal box with a mixture of hope and profound dread. He knew, with an instinct that transcended logic, that whatever was inside held the final answer to his family's fate. It was the last message from the house, the final piece of the puzzle that John and Mary had left behind, trusting that one day someone would come looking for the truth. Rossi used a small tool to gently pry open the rusted lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded cotton, was not a document or a weapon, but a single 5-inch reel of audio tape. It was 1/4-inch magnetic tape, a common format for portable reel-to-reel recorders in the early 1960s. John Sterling, the quiet, methodical scientist, had not just prepared a shelter for his family. He had prepared to document the confrontation with his partner. He had planned to capture the truth on tape, creating a record that could not be disputed or dismissed. The discovery of the audio reel electrified the investigation. This was the potential proof trophy Rossi had been searching for, a direct, unfiltered recording of the events of that night. It was a voice from the grave, a piece of evidence that could potentially bypass all circumstantial arguments and place Silas Blackwood at the scene of the crime, speaking in his own words. The challenge now was to recover the audio from the fragile 45-year-old tape without destroying it. The fate of the entire case now rested on the delicate magnetic particles of this single small reel. The team located one of the few audio forensics experts in the country capable of handling such a delicate restoration. The tape was sent under armed guard to a specialized lab, its journey tracked with the same urgency as a human witness. Back in Prosperity Creek, the news of the discovery leaked, and a palpable sense of an impending climax settled over the town. Silas Blackwood retreated even further into his mansion, refusing all comment, a cornered lion waiting for the final, inevitable blow. The entire community, and the legacy of its most powerful family, awaited the secrets held in the silent grooves of the tape. Arthur Vance sat with Rossi in the quiet of the command post, the weight of 45 years of waiting pressing down on him. He felt closer to his lost family than he had in decades, as if their final moments were about to be replayed for the world to hear. He was terrified of what the tape might contain, the sounds of violence, the pleas of his loved ones, but he knew he had to hear it. It was the end of a long, lonely road, a journey that had begun with a child's confusion and would now end with the unassailable, recorded truth. The investigation had methodically peeled back the layers of a 45-year-old lie, starting with a diary entry and culminating in a tiny hidden reel of tape. Each new discovery had systematically dismantled the official narrative, exposing the monstrous greed that lay at the heart of the town's prosperity. The truth was no longer a matter of speculation or historical debate. It was a physical object, a piece of evidence that had been waiting patiently in the dark for the right person to find it and press play. What final damning words had John Sterling managed to capture in the last moments of his life? The answer was spooling onto a modern digital workstation hundreds of miles away, an echo in the dust about to become a roar of justice. The call from the audio forensics lab came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the discovery of the tape. The expert's voice was clinical, but Ranger Rossi could detect an undercurrent of awe. The restoration was a success. The delicate magnetic particles, dormant for 45 years, had been coaxed into giving up their secret. A secure digital file was transmitted to the command post in Prosperity Creek. For a long moment, Rossi, her lead investigator, and Arthur Vance simply stared at the audio icon on the laptop screen. It was a small, innocuous symbol representing the final explosive truth of a crime that had haunted generations. Arthur's hands were clasped so tightly, his knuckles were white, his entire life leading to this single, terrifying moment of revelation. Rossi cleared the room, leaving only herself and Arthur. She felt it was his right and his burden to hear it first, without the presence of strangers. She clicked the play button. The first sound to emerge was not a voice, but the familiar crackling hiss of old tape, a sound like falling rain. Then, underneath it, the very real sound of a torrential downpour and the distant roll of thunder. The audio was a perfect, chilling time capsule, transporting them back to the Sterling family's living room on that fateful night in 1962. It was as if a window had been opened directly into the past, and they were about to become unseen witnesses to a murder. The first voice was John Sterling's, shockingly clear and calm. "I know what you've done, Silas," he said, his tone one of profound disappointment rather than anger. "I have the geological survey results from the independent lab in Midland. I know what's under the south pasture, and I know you've been filing fraudulent mineral claims through shell companies for the last 6 months." There was a pause filled only by the sound of the storm. John had not been a victim caught by surprise. He had been a scientist who had gathered his evidence and was confronting a man he once considered a friend. His quiet brilliance was on full display in his final moments. Silas Blackwood's voice entered the recording, dripping with a false, patronizing warmth that Arthur recognized instantly. "Now, John, you're letting your imagination run away with you. You're stressed about money. I get it. We can work this out." It was the same smooth, charismatic tone he had used for decades to charm and disarm everyone in Prosperity Creek. He was attempting to gaslight John, to paint him as unstable and paranoid. But John was unmoved, his resolve evident in his steady silence. The tape captured the precise moment when the folksy mask of Silas Blackwood began to slip, revealing the cold, calculating predator beneath. "There's no working this out," John's voice replied, the steel hardening in his words. "This isn't about debt. This is about theft on a scale this state has never seen. You were never my partner. You were a viper I let into my home." The accusation hung in the air, raw and absolute. This was the moment the confrontation pivoted from a business dispute to a matter of life and death. The recording captured Silas's short, sharp intake of breath, the sound of a man realizing he had been completely and utterly exposed. The game was over, and his only remaining move was one of unspeakable violence. The change in Silas's voice was terrifying. The warmth vanished, replaced by a flat, venomous cold. "You were always so much smarter than me, John, with your books and your maps. But you never understood one thing. It doesn't matter who finds the treasure. It only matters who's strong enough to take it." The words were a confession, a clear and unambiguous admission of his intent. This was the irrefutable proof Rossi needed, a statement of motive and malice delivered by the killer himself. Arthur Vance closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his wrinkled cheek as he heard the monster finally admit his sin. What followed was not a conversation, but a cacophony of violence. The sound of a heavy glass ashtray striking something solid was sickeningly clear, followed by a grunt of pain and the heavy, collapsing thud of a body hitting the floor. Then a woman's scream, Mary Sterling, her voice a blade of terror and grief. "John! Oh, God! Silas, no!" The recording captured the chaos, the sounds of a desperate struggle, of furniture being overturned. It was the audible ghost of a family's final violent moments, a nightmare preserved in magnetic dust. The horror was no longer abstract. It was real, immediate, and unbearable. Then, the most haunting sound of all. In the background, behind the struggle, the faint, terrified cries of a child could be heard from another room, a small voice calling for his mother. It was David or Emily, awakened by the commotion, their final moments on earth filled with a terror no child should ever know. The sound was abruptly cut off, followed by Mary's final choked cry, and then a profound, deep silence. The only sound that remained was the relentless drumming of the rain against the house, a neutral witness to the atrocity that had just occurred within its walls. The tape hissed for another 30 seconds before the recording ended. In the sterile quiet of the command post, Arthur Vance was openly weeping, a lifetime of suppressed grief pouring out in silent, shuddering sobs. He was not crying for the dead, but for the life they had been denied, for the truth that had been buried for so long under a mountain of lies. Rossi reached over and gently closed the laptop. Her face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. The time for investigation was over. The time for justice had arrived. She had his voice, his confession, and his crime. Within the hour, Ranger Rossi had secured an arrest warrant for Silas Blackwood on 4 counts of capital murder, along with a no-knock search warrant for his entire estate. The operation was executed with swift, overwhelming force. A convoy of Texas Ranger vehicles and local sheriff's cars descended upon the Blackwood mansion, their lights flashing in the late afternoon sun. It was a public spectacle, a declaration that no amount of wealth or influence could shield a man from the ghosts of his past. The entire town of Prosperity Creek watched as the foundations of their community began to publicly crumble. They found Silas Blackwood in his expansive, sunlit study, surrounded by the trappings of a life built on murder. He was in his wheelchair, a tartan blanket over his knees, looking out at his perfectly manicured gardens. His lawyers were present, already blustering about harassment and the fragility of their client's health. Silas himself projected an aura of untouchable indignation, the very picture of a wronged patriarch. He looked at Rossi with disdain, as if she were a mere nuisance trespassing on his hallowed ground. He still believed he was invincible, protected by the fortress of his own legacy. Rossi wasted no time on legal pleasantries. She walked to the center of the room, placed a portable digital audio player on a polished mahogany table, and without a single word, pressed play. The sound of the 1962 thunderstorm filled the opulent study, an eerie, atmospheric prelude. Silas's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion. Then he heard John Sterling's voice, clear as a bell, speaking to him from across a chasm of 45 years. "I know what you've done, Silas." The color drained from Blackwood's face. His carefully constructed composure began to visibly fracture. He listened, paralyzed, as the entire recording played out. He heard his own youthful, arrogant voice condemn him. He heard the sounds of the murder he had committed, the sickening thud of the ashtray, the screams of the woman who had once been his friend. The sounds of his crime, which he had successfully silenced for nearly half a century, were now echoing off the very walls that his blood money had built. His lawyers fell silent, their empty protests dying on their lips. There was no defense against this. This was not an accusation, it was a resurrection. When the recording ended, a thick, suffocating silence descended upon the room. Silas Blackwood was no longer a formidable patriarch. He was a shrunken, frail old man, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The ghost he had buried had returned to drag him down. Rossi stepped forward, her voice low and steady. "Silas Blackwood, you are under arrest for the murders of John, Mary, David, and Emily Sterling." He didn't even seem to hear her. He just stared at the small speaker on the table, as if it were an open coffin containing his own soul. The confession that followed was not a negotiation. It was a collapse. The dam of lies he had maintained for a lifetime broke, and the entire putrid truth flooded out. He admitted everything, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. He described how he had used the chaos of the storm to move the bodies, wrapping them in canvas, from his truck. He confessed that he had planned it for weeks, ever since John had first grown suspicious about the mineral rights filings. He had built the perfect crime, the perfect cover story, and had almost gotten away with it. Then he revealed the final, most monstrous secret of all. He told Rossi where he had put them. In 1963, as a gesture of his newfound civic leadership, he had personally financed and overseen the construction of a new town hall for Prosperity Creek. He confessed that on a moonless night, before the final concrete slab for the foundation was poured, he had buried the bodies of the entire Sterling family deep within the rebar-laced cavity. He had hidden them in the one place no one would ever think to look, directly beneath the seat of the town's own government, under the symbol of his supposed benevolence. The arrest of Silas Blackwood was the single most seismic event in the history of Prosperity Creek. The image of the town's founding father being led from his mansion in handcuffs was broadcast across the state. The story of his crime, the stolen oil fortune, the brutal murders, the diabolical burial, was a tale of Shakespearean greed and betrayal. The town was forced into a painful collective reckoning with its own history, realizing that its prosperity had been fertilized by the blood of an innocent family. The bronze statue of Silas in the town square was quietly removed overnight. Under the glare of television cameras, a construction crew with ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of anomalies in the town hall's foundation. Jackhammers broke the 4-decade-old concrete, the sound echoing through the stunned silence of the gathered crowd. It took an entire day of careful, grim excavation, but they were found. The remains of John, Mary, David, and Emily Sterling were recovered from their concrete tomb, finally freed from the foundation of the town that had forgotten them. The forensic evidence was absolute, corroborating every detail of Silas's confession. The trial was a formality. Faced with the audio recording and his own detailed confession, Silas Blackwood was found guilty on all 4 counts of capital murder. Due to his advanced age and failing health, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He died in a prison hospital less than 6 months later, a fallen king in a kingdom of his own making, his name now synonymous, not with prosperity, but with a deep and unforgivable evil. The Blackwood Empire, built on a lie, crumbled into legal battles and public disgrace. A week after the verdict, the entire town of Prosperity Creek gathered in the local cemetery for a funeral that was 45 years overdue. 4 new caskets were lowered into the earth under a clear Texas sky. Arthur Vance, his shoulders unburdened for the first time in his adult life, delivered the eulogy. He did not speak of murder or of oil, but of his Aunt Mary's kindness, his Uncle John's quiet intelligence, and the bright, unlived futures of his 2 young cousins. He restored their names, replacing the town's ghost story with the simple, human truth of the family he had loved and lost. With the Sterlings finally laid to rest, a quiet peace settled over Arthur. His long, lonely vigil was over. He had carried the torch of their memory through decades of darkness, never wavering in his belief in their innocence. He had lived to see their names cleared and their murderer brought to justice. He had restored their honor. He placed a single, smooth stone, the kind his young cousin David used to collect, on each of the 4 headstones, his final act of remembrance before walking away, his duty finally and completely fulfilled. Prosperity Creek began the slow, painful process of rebuilding its identity, not on the myth of a benevolent founder, but on the hard, uncovered truth of its past. The story of the Sterling family became a new kind of legend, a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of greed and the incredible resilience of truth. It served as a permanent reminder that history is never truly settled, and that the ground beneath our feet often holds secrets we are not prepared to face, secrets that will, inevitably, find their way to the surface. The case of the Sterling family was officially closed. The files were archived, the evidence cataloged, the legal process concluded. But for those who had been touched by the story, it was a profound lesson in the persistence of memory and the moral arc of the universe. Time can obscure and lies can fester for decades, but they cannot erase what happened. For truth, like a faint echo trapped in the dust, will wait patiently, for as long as it takes, for someone to finally have the courage to listen.